entire VideoTours library is available for purchase by corporations, educators, and individuals.
Fifes and drums attend. Gun! Fifes up! Ready! March!
More than 200 years ago, American patriots debated the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Early Virginia colonists realized that they were living in an entirely new country, a country that had to learn how to govern itself and gain its independence. So all white men of sound body and strong teeth were asked to join the newly forming Continental Army.
With your teeth. You gotta have two to be in the Army.
Today at Colonial Williamsburg, visitors can recapture that feeling, that experience of becoming an American. We can understand how far we've come since the beginning, and also how far we have to go. But in the 1920s, that experience was just a dream. It began in the spring of 1926 at a meeting of two unusual men whose paths would never have crossed in normal circumstances. One was the rector of a parish church in a small southern town, Dr. William A.R. Goodwin. The other was one of the wealthiest men in the world, John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The meeting was not accidental. Goodwin had worked long and hard to make it happen. He'd lured Rockefeller to Williamsburg, hoping to work his persuasive magic on the cautious multimillionaire. Goodwin had a vision he believed could forever change America's understanding and appreciation of its own history. But he needed financial help to make this vision a reality. Goodwin wanted to roll back nearly 200 years of history. He wanted to restore Williamsburg to its glory days, when it was the prestigious capital of colonial Virginia. He wanted to give citizens the chance to travel to a previous era as surely as if they were using a time machine. When Rockefeller came to Williamsburg, Goodwin laid out his vision with irresistible salesmanship, and he persuaded the heir to the world's largest oil fortune to join with him to make it happen. In this partnership, Goodwin would provide the vision, and Rockefeller would provide the funds needed to bring it to life. What was this place that had so inspired Dr. Goodwin and induced a businessman and philanthropist to agree to donate several $1 million to restore it, and eventually to spend $68 million? It was not what Williamsburg was in the mid-1920s, but what it had been 150 years earlier. A vibrant 18th-century community, the capital of Virginia, the largest and one of the most prosperous of the 13 colonies Britain had carved out of the eastern seaboard of America. Officials here governed a vast area which stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the scarcely explored wilderness of Illinois country. In 1775, Williamsburg was home to about 2,000 people. In town, the families of tradesmen and merchants lived in modest but practical houses, often with workshops in the backyard. Families of the rich and the powerful occupied houses that boasted every conceivable luxury of the day. About half of Williamsburg's population consisted of African American slaves who lived in kitchens and outbuildings around town. Many more lived in rudimentary quarters at nearby plantations, where they helped make possible an economy based on corn, wheat, and most important, tobacco. But there was more to the Williamsburg economy than that. People came to town from miles around to buy and trade for the necessities of life. As well as to glimpse the latest fashions from England and Europe. The barrels, kegs, and containers made by nearby coopers were in high demand for shipping tobacco, grains, and other products both here and abroad. People from the entire county came to the Williamsburg courthouse to recover debts, record deeds, or to answer for their misdeeds. In those days, robbery could be a hanging offense, and people were locked in the pillory or stocks for lesser crimes.
Two hours would do you good, man.
Townspeople and visitors gathered at taverns to satisfy their appetites and exchange those essentials of community life, news, and gossip.
Sorry, sir. Be comfortable.
They also stopped in at the wig maker to let their hair down and to talk about the latest goings-on in town. Founded in 1699 as Virginia's seat of government, Williamsburg was a carefully planned community. Its streets were laid out according to the ideals of the time. At the heart of the town lay Bruton Parish Church, the religious and social center of the entire region. Residents of Williamsburg worshiped here according to the official Anglican religion, which they were taxed to support.
They saw him, they recounted what they had been told about this child, and all who heard were astonished.
The governor's palace to the north, with its splendid entryway and magnificent ballroom, was the official residence of the British Crown's appointed representative. Citizens could come here to ask the governor to settle disputes or intervene with higher authority back in England. To the west lay the College of William and Mary, where the sons of wealthy and powerful men prepared themselves for future positions of leadership. Among those who studied here, future presidents Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe. To the east lay the elegant Capitol building, its two sides offering separate meeting places for the House of Burgesses and the Governor's Council, Virginia's legislative bodies. The early statesmen who gathered in these chambers created the essential components of a new and unique experiment in self-government, the American democracy. Virginia's revolution began here on May 26, 1774, when the colonial governor dissolved the House of Burgesses. The Burgesses angrily reassembled at Raleigh Tavern and resumed their meeting on no authority but their own. 2 years later, Virginia's patriot leaders Patrick Henry and James Madison asked the new Continental Congress to declare the independence of the American colonies from Britain. Considering the events that happened here, it is easy to understand why Dr. Goodwin dreamed of restoring Williamsburg to its 18th century appearance, and why Rockefeller was captivated by his vision. But why did Williamsburg need restoring at all? Soon after America declared its independence from Britain, Virginia authorities moved the seat of government inland to Richmond because they were afraid Williamsburg was vulnerable to British attack from the sea. Throughout the Revolutionary War and later during the Civil War, several armies occupied Williamsburg, and all took their toll on the town's historic structures. Over the years, many others were damaged or destroyed by fires. Time brought other changes to Williamsburg as people changed homes and other buildings to meet their needs and tastes.
In 1926, this was a very ordinary town filled with ordinary people like you and me. And their houses, while old, nevertheless had been changed many, many times in the years between the 18th century when they were built and 1926. People had wanted bathrooms and they put bathrooms in, or they had torn out things that they thought were old-fashioned and fuddy-duddy. And so they had changed like most old buildings do change. They reflect the many periods through which they have survived.
In 1876, the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition inspired new interest in colonial times. In Williamsburg, the new Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities bought the old Powder magazine to operate as a museum. And in 1902, Bruton Parish Church welcomed a new rector who accepted the post on the condition that the interior of the building be restored to its colonial appearance. He was Dr. William A.R. Goodwin.
Around the turn of the century, Americans of English descent decided that they needed to preserve their neglected heritage. Goodwin, the Reverend W.A.R. Goodwin, was one of those pioneers. His vision was a Williamsburg restored. His dream, the part that seemed probably even more fantastic, was that he could find somebody to pay for it. He tried for many years to interest philanthropists in this crack-brained dream of his, and he finally found one, John D. Rockefeller, Jr.
Williamsburg came to be one of the activities that Father became involved in during his life that meant most to him. I think he enjoyed all aspects of it. He liked to be involved in the detail of it, but he also appreciated the broader historical and educational implications.
Rockefeller first paid for some preliminary plans, then bought the Ludwell Paradise House, eventually and finally committing himself to the purchase and restoration of the entire town. It was an effort that would take a tremendous amount of scholarly detective work.
When Rockefeller and Goodwin started all this, they really had to invent the techniques. There weren't hosts of architects and architectural historians and archaeologists who specialized in this kind of work. And they therefore, by trial and error, put together teams of architects or archaeologists who'd received their training in Arizona and Egypt to come here to this 18th century town and invent the techniques that have since, of course, become standard practice in the field.
This team had a daunting mission: to probe Earth and history in order to understand and be able to recreate the essence of 18th century life. It was their job to discover what lay beneath the remodeled walls and facades, to determine the appearance of buildings and gardens long gone, to figure out what didn't belong as well as what did. Among other things, restoring Williamsburg meant developing a whole new set of disciplines, for no one had ever restored an entire town before. In some cases, restoration meant relearning how to make things the old way, when new processes and materials wouldn't look historically accurate.
Well, beyond looking at the landscape and reconstructing it and helping to bring it back in 3 dimensions, the archaeologists can help us furnish our buildings and basically clothe the people that would have lived there, establish the kinds of ceramics they may have eaten their meals off of, and so forth, because these things, many of these things, were thrown away. And archaeology provides, in a sense, a counterpoint to the materials that survived as heirlooms, what we call antiques today. Antiques survive as antiques because they were always valuable. Somebody always valued them. That's why they stayed reasonably intact, unbroken. The things that people didn't value as much, or accidentally broken in other cases, wound up being thrown away. And until we got the kind of centralized garbage pickup that we have today, people just threw their garbage away where it was convenient. Oftentimes that was right in their backyard.
There's nothing easy about restoration. Sometimes the evidence is contradictory. Sometimes there's not enough evidence. It's like a huge puzzle with an infinite number of pieces.
In 1929, the reconstruction of the Wren building was underway. And also at that time, Mary Goodwin was in Oxford, England, doing research at the Bodleian Library. And she made the very important and timely discovery of this copper plate. And it shows a very detailed image of the Wren building, and most importantly, the back facade of the Wren building. So she called back to the States, had the construction halted, and radiographed an image back to the architects. And they were able to alter the roof line to the correct configuration, which you see behind us here today.
60 years after we discovered the Bodleian Plate in England, we're still making remarkable discoveries about Williamsburg buildings and their interiors. We found a large group of documents also in England that told us about the Governor's Palace. For example, it told us all about the Governor's Palace ballroom, the blue wallpaper, the gilt border, what supplies were needed, how much it cost, who put it up, when, and people's reactions to the paper when it was installed. It's amazing how much we're still discovering about Williamsburg buildings.
Well, you can read a building the way you can read a book. You have to know the language of architecture, and once you know that, then you can understand how that grammar works, how everything fits together, and you can see when certain things don't fit together, just like 2 sentences may not fit together. You know something's wrong, something has been left out, something has been changed. And it's the same way with looking at a building.
As our technology advances, we put the pieces together in more accurate ways, and we continue to learn more about the past.
We also use physical remains that really can only be seen through a microscope. Things that tell us about what, for example, was growing in a particular planting bed that we may have identified by finding a rectangular stain in the soil. We can then carefully sample that soil and retrieve microscopic remains that can tell us, let's say, for example, that they were growing asparagus in that particular planting bed. We can actually get it down to that level of precision now.
The restoration of Williamsburg was really a monumental task. It's taken upwards of 60 years for thousands of people to bring this town back into existence. It's hard to believe that Dr. Goodwin or even Mr. Rockefeller suspected the magnitude and the complexity of the task. There are over 500 buildings here in the historic area, and all of those had to be either restored or reconstructed based on physical or historical evidence.
Dr. Goodwin and Mr. Rockefeller wanted Americans of every age and persuasion to be able to visit easily, enjoy and understand what they had created at Colonial Williamsburg. To help visitors understand and appreciate what they were seeing, they recruited men and women trained in colonial history and dressed them in colonial garb. Today, hundreds of these interpreters occupy the town day and night.
Although Miss Custis, she may be the person living in the house and the person who owns the land, but really it belongs to the good Lord. And I don't know a man that don't like working on the good Lord's property. All these blades of grass here, I look at it as though they belong to me. Each one of them is my own little children, and I works on them, and I takes care of them, and when I see them grow, I feel like I have done something.
Dr.
See, that's what
Goodwin
I
and
wanna do with
Mr.
the
Rockefeller are long gone now, but Colonial Williamsburg is a reminder of their patriotic vision and generosity of spirit. Today, Colonial Williamsburg is staffed by close to 4,000 employees.
Hey there, Kate, wake up. I know the day is over, but my goodness gracious.
It is an outdoor museum, including 18th century buildings that have been restored or reconstructed, and also the furniture and decorations within them, and the gardens and grounds on which they are set. It is a living restoration of the 18th century capital, where hundreds of costumed interpreters perform trades and household chores just as they were done more than 200 years ago.
This is a gown that we've made here in the shop, totally by hand, 18th century technology.
How long did it take to make it?
About 92 hours.
These demonstrations show visitors how trades were accomplished in the 18th century. But in a deeper sense, they are laboratory experiments in history, intended to discover exactly how people lived in the 18th century.
What are you making? Working on some parts for a hoe.
Colonial Williamsburg, a focus of academic research in archaeology, architecture, decorative arts, and other disciplines, is also the location of two major art galleries.
DeWitt Wallace Gallery has collections of such importance that if it were in any other city, people would make that a destination just to see the Wallace Gallery. Being in Williamsburg, we have a bonus that we have an entire historic area to act as a focal point.
The Abby Aldrich Rockefeller Folk Art Center has an unsurpassed collection of folk art. These are objects made, painted, embroidered, or put together by ordinary men and women, untrained in the formal artistic traditions of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. Here you'll get a real sense of how ordinary men and women were inspired to express themselves and to decorate their surroundings.
Wait, not too fast. Take it down.
Colonial Williamsburg is also an educational institution with a well-planned curriculum of many layers devoted to teaching young and old about the character of 18th century America.
The safety, you pull on the trigger, bang on the cock. If properly working, it will not go off half-cocked.
And about the role Williamsburg and its most famous residents played in the creation of the new country. Because Colonial Williamsburg is so many things, it appeals to a broad range of people, drawing more than 1 million visitors every year. Many are repeat visitors, finding a new experience here every time they come. Over the years, these visitors have included Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Dwight Eisenhower, Queen Elizabeth II, and Prince Philip. And in 1983, Ronald Reagan hosted the World Economic Summit in Williamsburg.
In the early years of the restoration, we focused primarily on the political events that took place in Williamsburg and the well-known patriot figures who came and went from town. As time has moved on, however, visitors to Colonial Williamsburg have become more interested in what people like themselves were doing in their everyday lives in the 18th century. And so we as historians have begun to focus more on the family, what women's lives were like, what the culture was like in the African American community.
It was a sense of responsibility to the past and to the future that originally inspired the restoration of Colonial Williamsburg. That sense of responsibility is still intensely felt by the organization's present stewards, who have assigned themselves a mission: to give visitors a vivid and enduring sense of what becoming Americans meant in those years, as well as what it means today.
People explore their interests in history many ways. Teachers in classrooms can teach historical facts and ideas, and folks can pick up books and explore the world of historical ideas and facts in books. Here at Williamsburg, Dr. Goodwin said folks would come and walk on enchanted ground. It's experiential. Come, know that you're walking where Jefferson walked. You can smell what's happening in the kitchens. You can touch and feel selectively. There's a first-person contact with history here.
To be an American is not an ethnic statement. It's not clearly not a racial statement. It's not a statement about one's religious beliefs, but rather, to be an American, one has to support a government that believes in ideals and is striving to reach a certain set of ideals. And if you look at our government as a government that is a government that's based on these ideals of liberty and justice and freedom for all people, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then one sees the process of becoming an American as striving to reach those ideals.
Decades ago, Mr. Rockefeller summed up his reason for supporting Williamsburg's restoration. He did it, he said, so that the future may learn from the past. For even now, more than 200 years after the Revolution, we are still becoming Americans.
The entire VideoTours library is available for purchase by corporations, educators, and individuals.